Let's break down our must-add waiver wire players for Week 13 of the 2025 fantasy football season. All right, let's kick it off with John Metchie of the New York Jets, sitting at just 8% rostered, 18.5 fantasy points in Week 12, 7 targets, 6 catches, 65 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He now has 13.5 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and a receiving touchdown in 2 straight games as well. And he's really emerged as the number one receiving option currently for the New York Jets, as we've seen no Garrett Wilson for the past few weeks and does not look like he is set to return at any point soon. Seen a little bit of volume still going to AD Mitchell, but once again, 7 targets this past week, only 2 catches. 6 targets the previous week, but only 1 catch in that Week 11 matchup against the Patriots. So ultimately, John Metchie has been the true number one wide receiver. Really felt like with Tyrod Taylor as the starting quarterback in Week 12 for the New York Jets, that Metchie was his favorite wide receiver throughout the course of this game against the Ravens. So Week 13, a good matchup against the Falcons on paper, at least. I don't know, this Falcons defense is a bit sporadic. They show up some weeks like they did this past week, and then other weeks they look really bad on defense, but it's a pretty solid strength of schedule here against the Falcons, Dolphins, and Jaguars in terms of purely just looking at secondaries over the next couple weeks. So if you guys are hurting at the wide receiver position, you need help at the flex area. At the end of the day, I always say bad offenses still produce good fantasy players, and right now Metchie is the number one wide receiver for the Jets, so he is definitely worth adding as we move into Week 13. Next up, let's talk about Jaden Higgins of the Texans, sitting at 23% rostered, 13.8 fantasy points in Week 12, 9 targets, 4 catches, 38 receiving yards, and a touchdown against Buffalo. And once again here, we have a bit of an issue here. We don't know if it's going to be Davis Mills at the quarterback position or CJ Stroud, but the passing attack has seemed to be a bit more fluent with Davis Mills at the quarterback position. He had no turnovers this past week, 2 passing touchdowns, and ultimately Jaden Higgins, a nice 9 targets overall in Week 12. Obviously, Nico Collins still playing as the primary wide receiver here, but he only had 3 targets this past week, and Christian Kirk did find the end zone off of 6 targets this past week. So, the issue with the Texans wide receivers all season long has just been there's so many different passing options, and they haven't been consistent on a week-to-week basis. We also, have some volume to Jalen Noel, but just 2 targets this past week. Then Dalton Schultz, the tight end position at times as well, but he just came out with 4 targets, 1 catch this past week. Jaden Higgins has at least given you double-digit fantasy performances in 3 of the last 5 games. So once again, not incredibly consistent, but the Texans on the road the next 2 weeks against the Colts and the Chiefs, 2 matchups where they're going to need to throw the football, keep up with both of those offenses, and ultimately, in order to stay in those games, throw the football like we saw this past week against the Bills, right? And then they get the Cardinals and the Raiders before a tough matchup against the Chargers. So pretty favorable strength of schedule here. And don't forget, especially with the Colts losing this past week and the Texans and Jaguars both winning, that division is still open as the Colts have to play the Texans twice and the Jaguars twice to wrap up the season. So, there's a very good, playoff picture here for the Texans who have an elite defense. So this is a big matchup in Week 13. I expect the Texans to throw the football a good bit this week. And once again, there is some inconsistency here at the wide receiver position for the Texans, but Jaden Higgins, I think at least worth rostering as we move into Week 13. Next up, let's look at Chimere Dike, the Tennessee Titans, 23% rostered, 21.4 fantasy points in Week 12, 7 targets, 5 catches, 44 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Also had a punt return touchdown on top of that. So we've talked about DK throughout the course of the season over the past couple weeks, and it's been tough, right? He just 3.4 fantasy points in Week 11, 7.5 in Week 9, that bye week in Week 10, but the previous 2 weeks in Week 7 and 8, 16.4 or more fantasy points. So he's definitely been fantasy relevant at times, but also at the end of the day, this Titans offense has, been the worst in the league and incredibly difficult to trust. And I think that's, put a lot of fantasy managers off of Chimere Dike, but we got to give Cam Ward some praise here. This was his first fantasy relevant week, 28 of 42, 256 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a rushing touchdown, and he had 23 fantasy points. But I'm not ready to really overreact to that quite yet. It's a kind of a tough, strength of schedule here, getting the Jaguars and the Browns over the next 2 weeks. The Jaguars, one of these teams that the secondary is really weak, but they are good at getting after the quarterback. And and all that. So listen, I don't really know if this Titans offense is, about to open up and the passing attack's going to be fluent or anything, but DK has been the best fantasy option in terms of Titans wide receivers so far on the season. Van Jefferson had just one target, one catch this past week, and we know they've been dealing with a lot of injuries, between Calvin Ridley and LKO Manor, so the volume is certainly there moving forward for Chimere Dike. So yeah, he's risky, but if you're hurting at wide receiver, you need some depth in terms of flex options. I do think DK is worth adding moving into week 13 of the season. Next up, we have Greg Dortch of the Arizona Cardinals sitting at 18% rostered, 16.8 fantasy points in week 12, 9 targets, 6 catches, 53 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Since the absence of Marvin Harrison Jr., we've seen Greg Dortch now have 16.8 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and a receiving touchdown in 2 straight games. We talked a bit about Greg Dortch in last week's video, although we focused more on Michael Wilson, who also had a really good fantasy day with 21.8 fantasy points. Now, kind of the question here is, is Marvin Harrison going to be able to play in week 13 or not? Is that added volume going to be there for guys like Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch? I would be maybe more concerned about Greg Dortch having any value if MH returns. I think at this point, Michael Wilson has earned some volume here, no matter the status of Marvin Harrison Jr., but this is a good matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Either way, this is one of those games that feels like it could have a high-scoring, offensive-sided thing for both teams here. So if we see no Marvin Harrison Jr. in Week 13, I think Greg Dortch, sitting at just 18% rostered, is a player who will get volume moving into Week 13 once again, because the Cardinals just consistently put themselves in these positions where they need to throw the football. We see Jacoby Brissett just slinging it all over the place. I mean, he had 49 passing attempts in Week 12. Don't forget, he set the NFL record in Week 11 with 57 pass attempts. So just 8 less pass attempts here in Week 12. It's a really pass-heavy offense at the end of the day. So it may depend on the status of Marvin Harrison Jr., but either way, keep a close eye on the Cardinals wide receivers, moving into Week 13. Next up, we have Andre Yoshivas, Yoshi himself, 10.6 fantasy points in Week 12, 7 targets, 4 catches, 61 receiving yards. Definitely not a monster day whatsoever, but with no Jamar Chase on the field, we knew there would be some added volume. 2 additional wide receivers here for the Bengals. Joe Flacco, not exactly inspiring throwing the football in Week 12, but Yoshivas made the most of it with those 4 receptions for 61 receiving yards in terms of his involvement. But kind of the big thing here is, yes, we're going to get Jamar Chase back in Week 13 on the road against the Ravens on Thanksgiving Day. But T. Higgins, sustained a concussion, a pretty nasty-looking concussion. Now it's a short week. And ultimately, I think there's a good chance that we see no T. Higgins in Week 13 against a, Ravens secondary that hasn't been great on the season. They look a lot better as of late. They've gotten a lot healthier, but ultimately on the season, still ranking bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So if we see no T. Higgins, he's stuck in concussion protocol in Week 13, once again a short week, then playing on the holiday on Thursday, then I think Yoshivas is at least a floor option, in terms of a flex add moving into Week 13 of the season. Last wide receiver I want to mention is Isaiah Hodgins of the New York Giants, 12.2 fantasy points in Week 12, just 2 catches off of 6 targets, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Will face the New England Patriots in Week 13. So ultimately, I don't know that I like this matchup too much, but the Patriots still rank just 18th against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. And then kind of the other issue here is, we don't know if Jackson Dart's going to play in Week 13 or not. My belief has been, and I've talked about this, throughout the comment sections and the live stream this past week, right? I think that Jackson Dart might just sit through the bye week. It would make some sense here with 2 tough road matchups against the Lions, the Patriots, 2 good defenses, although the Lions defense not show up this past week. And for Jackson Dart, there's no reason for the Giants to really risk him at this point in the season and, put any risk towards his future. So I think there's a strong chance that Jackson Dart actually sits in Week 13. If we see Jameis Winston out there again, Hodgins has had 10.7 or more fantasy points in each of the 2 starts with Winston at quarterback. And then on top of that, Winston looked out of his mind good this past week. He looked like a typical Jameis Winston, right? 366 passing yards, did throw an interception, but had 2 passing touchdowns receiving touchdowns. So, Hodgins is at least getting the volume when Winston is on the field, and maybe Hodgins can be a player that does step up even if Jackson Dart plays. But, we did see Darius Slayton return to the lineup this past week, but just 2 targets and 1 catch for Slayton. So Hodgins got more overall volume than obviously Rondell Robinson, still the primary wide receiver for this team, and Theo Johnson getting some volume at the tight end position as well. So might depend on the status of Jackson Dart and if Jameis Winston's the starter or not in week 13. But ultimately, once again, a true desperation flex is what we're looking at with Isaiah Hodgins moving into week 13. Moving to the running back position, let's take a look at Devin Neal of the New Orleans Saints, sitting at just 9% rostered. We saw Alvin Kamara exit that week 12 matchup against the Falcons relatively early. He's now dealing with a knee injury, and don't forget, Kamara was already questionable going into this week 13 or week 12 matchup. So I think in week 13 against the Miami Dolphins, there's a really strong chance that Devin Neal is the starting running back for the New Orleans Saints, and he ended up with 11.1 fantasy points, 7 rushing attempts for 18 rushing yards, but more importantly, probably 7 targets, 5 catches, 43 receiving yards for Devin Neal. And this is a pretty good matchup. Now, bear in mind, the Dolphins have improved against the run, but once again, this is a team that is in the bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. So I don't know if I see a crazy high ceiling, especially because, the quarterback play out of Tyler Shuck this past week wasn't necessarily inspiring to say the least, but still, if he's going to be the RB1, that's something we're always looking for in terms of potential waiver options. In the day, volume is always king, so he's going to be one of these players that really moves up in overall roster percentage, especially if we do see Alvin Kamara ruled out this week. So he's going to be added early. Go ahead and jump on him. He is a waiver wire priority add moving into week 13. And speaking of injured players, let's take a look at Dylan Samson, who finished with 16.2 fantasy points, 7 rushing attempts for 23 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 catches, 59 receiving yards, and a long receiving touchdown. He sits at just 11% rostered, but all of that happened because of an injury to Quinshon Judkins. Now, ultimately, we don't really know the true status on Judkins, how serious this injury is, but we know it was serious enough to keep him out of the rest of the game against the Raiders in week 12. So this is one to kind of monitor here as the week progresses, but this week 13 matchup against the 49ers is certainly not the best matchup, but not the worst. They're 18th overall against the running back position, and I know the Browns pulled through with the win here, but the offense still wasn't overly inspiring. They ran the football well. Sanders got that, kind of screen pass, short yardage pass, set up to Dylan Samson. He took it all the way for a touchdown. But outside of that, the passing attack wasn't exactly fluent. And the Niners defense still a bit banged up right now, but I don't know if the Browns are going to have the same success here in week 13. Ultimately, we'll find out. But once again, volume is king. And if Dylan Samson is going into week 13 as the lead back for the Browns, then he's going to have a lot of fantasy value. Now, we didn't really see any volume to Jerome Ford. He had 1 carry for -3 yards, but of course he could always get some involvement as well if Judkins missed time. But at the end of the day, the running back with upside here, he obviously is coming off of a game where he scored on a nice touchdown, is going to be Dylan Samson, so he's going to be worth the add moving into week 13. Then I do want to mention Emmanuel Wilson. I know he's sitting at 68% rostered, so pretty highly rostered, but he had 26.5 fantasy points in week 12 against the Vikings, 107 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 catches off of 2 targets, and 18 receiving yards. Now, the expectation is that Josh Jacobs will be available in week 13. It's a Thanksgiving Day game on the road against a divisional opponent in the Lions. So I do think Jacobs is going to play, but I think Emmanuel Wilson has really kind of solidified himself as one of these stronger handcuffs in fantasy right now, because we know this Packers offense, they're just going to run the football a tremendous amount at the end of the day. 28 rushing attempts, 2 targets to Emmanuel Wilson, 30 total touches, 2 touchdowns. That is elite overall usage, at the running back position, whether it's Josh Jacobs or not. And then once again, we could potentially see some sort of setback to Josh Jacobs, who did sustain that knee injury in week 11. So I know he's pretty highly rostered. I know a lot of people have already gone over this over the past week. And then unfortunately, we really didn't get get the news that Josh Jacobs was out till kind of last minute. So I know some people didn't even get to start Emmanuel Wilson in week 12, but ultimately he's a very strong handcuff. If we do see any type of setback or re-injury to Josh Jacobs, which I'm certainly not wishing for, then Emmanuel Wilson is going to be an absolute, must-start player on a week-to-week basis just due to the volume the running back position sees in this offense. It is a tough matchup against the Lions this week. That run defense still pretty good, but it didn't look very good this past week. They still rank very, very high in terms of fantasy points allowed. One of the better overall units. I mean, going into week 12, they were giving up the fewest fantasy points to running backs. But still, once again, due to volume alone, if Emmanuel Wilson is out there, especially if you're hurting at running back, even if he ends up just being a handcuff, he's an elite handcuff as we move into the end of the season. And then I will also very quickly mention Chris Rodriguez of the Washington Commanders on bye week in week 12, sits at just 29% rostered. But I've talked about this for a few weeks now. I really feel like Rodriguez is the lead back for the Commanders. He's been seeing more and more volume, getting more and more red zone usage. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of, volume sprinkled into JCM and Jeremy McNichols. It's frustrating at times, but still, since week 7 of the season, we've seen Chris Rodriguez score in every game except for 2. Not a great matchup in week 13 against the Denver Broncos, but then it softens up a bit against the Vikings and the Giants. So ultimately, once again, this is just one of those volume things. There's not a lot of upside here, but he is getting the red zone usage. He did have 5.2 yards per carry last time we saw him in action in week 11 against the Dolphins and 79 yards on the ground. So I've talked about him a bit. He's got a pretty good strength of schedule for the playoffs outside of that week 16 matchup against the Eagles. And I mean, it's still a good matchup against the Cowboys in week 17, but that run defense has definitely improved with, getting healthier and some of the trades they've made. But still, if he's out there and available, I still believe he's the Commanders running back who's going to see the most volume towards the end of the season. He's worth adding if you're hurting at the running back position here in week 13. There, guys, have it there. My must-add players from the waiver wire moving into week 13 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever as the week progresses, please leave me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, don't forget we'll have everything here on the channel as the week progresses that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So go check out all the content throughout the week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.